One of the reasons that I have a tendency to have greater respect for George Washington than Mr. Dershowitz appears to have for him is that I actually quote him accurately. I would have to say that what Washington actually said was not that we must never indulge the supposition. What he actually said was, we must with caution indulge the supposition. I'm not going to spend a good deal of time this evening going into that difference, but it's actually a great difference, because it meant that Washington was actually both more knowledgeable and wiser than Mr. Dershowitz gives him credit for. He, on the one hand, recognizes, if you understand, I believe, the meaning of that phrase, the possibility that there are going to be good people who don't acknowledge the existence of God and who are not good by virtue of religion. That's why he says you indulge it with caution. He doesn't say don't indulge it. He says indulge it with caution. But what does caution imply? Well, caution implies that you're indulging something that's dangerous, and that you move down a road that could lead to destructive possibilities. So you put on a yellow light because you want to avoid that destruction. In that regard, I think Washington had a great deal of respect for the truth, because he understood that the point of statesmanship is not to win debates. It's to try to guide nations down paths that will actually avoid for them the worst consequences. And I think that's the question we actually face here. And we can't trivialize it by pretending that anybody suggests that this or that interpretation of religion ought to be imposed by force on anybody and so forth and so on. Furthest thing from my mind and the mind of any reasonable, decent Americans, which we all understand. However we disagree about the First Amendment, one thing we know is it doesn't allow that. And that is not in question here. But what is in question is whether or not we understand the distinction that I think has to be made between what is possible for human beings and what is possible for societies. It's something that I think has been recognized both by philosophers and by religious thinkers, because the aim of our human life as individuals goes rather beyond that of our life as social beings. To put it in old terminology, the aim of our life as social beings is justice, but justice is not the ultimate good for the individual. Indeed, according to my religious faith as a Christian, I actually get something besides justice from God. If God was going to be just to me, I would be punished. Alan Dershowitz says, well, God shouldn't punish you just because you come to the conclusion that you don't believe in him, and so forth and so on. Well, the truth of the matter is, according to the Bible, we all have merited punishment anyway. And we don't escape it by our own merits. That's not the point. The point is we escape it because God is merciful, and he doesn't punish us because he has offered us, without our having to get involved in it, a way to salvation. And salvation is actually a greater good than justice. But it's a greater good that I think we recognize rightly in this society is to be pursued by individuals according to their conscience, and that they must be respected in their freedom to seek out that path which will lead them to salvation. To think it through, to pray over it, to meditate over it, to open their hearts to it, and to follow that path which results from that, and from what I believe is in the end the grace of God in their lives. But all of that can't be done by force, and nobody suggests that it should be. None of it can be imposed. Can't force somebody to be saved. See? And so it's never even a question. We caricature things that haven't even been suggested, and then we pretend we've said something. There is a greater challenge, though. There is a greater challenge, though. See, because I don't think the founders were as narrow-minded and silly as some people want to imply. That's why Washington's phrase was quite weighty and complex. And Mr. Dershowitz' characterization of that phrase reduced it to a caricature. One of the most complex figures in our founding was probably Thomas Jefferson. Lots of people say he didn't believe in God. He sure tolerated the mention of his name a lot for a guy who didn't believe in him. But I would actually like to say, though, that if he didn't believe in him, that's a stronger case than anything as to why we need to take a second look at the American Declaration of Independence and the acquiescence of Jefferson and some others like him in the reference to the Creator there. Let us assume for the moment that all the Jefferson is atheist people are correct. See? If Jefferson didn't acquiesce in the reference to the Creator because he thought it was true, maybe he did it because he thought it was necessary. See? Necessary for what? necessary in order to complete the argument that constrains human power. Necessary in order to establish a ground so that the weak and the defenseless, so that those with no power, those with no eloquence, those with no case to be made by their money or their status or anything else about them, would be able to stand in the face of every human power whatsoever and demand respect for their human rights and dignity. Do we think that that comes about? Do we think that that comes about because Alan Dershowitz feels like it today or Alan Keyes feels like it today? No. The challenge of human history has been to come up with a principle of justice so couched that the powers that so often have claimed to be the substance of justice must nonetheless be bound by it, and so that those who have been docilely subject to those powers in the many centuries of human abuse would never again believe it was right, even when they did not have the power to stand for the time being against those who oppressed them. Okay? How do you get there? How do you get there? See, because the argument down through human history has been, quite frankly, that might makes right. And sure, philosophers in their closet have come up with other things. They do it all the time. But philosophers in the closet don't govern nations. Philosophers in the closet don't move human heart and shape human conscience and characteristics directly. That has to be done by other agencies, and sadly those agencies down through the years have been unconstrained in so many instances by elements of conscience, except where they were produced by incidental things. You are my brethren in this, in that, in biology, in tribe, in ethnicity, in war, and so I will not abuse my power against you. But what about those beings left out of the purview of those definitions of community, who have nothing to recommend them in their dignity except the bare humanity that they can claim? Why respect them? Down through the ages, power hasn't had much respect for them at all. And as I said to a young lady in a class today, the challenge of all of this, you see, is not just to shape the ordinary consciences or the good consciences, no. How do we get the folks who would otherwise be tempted to abuse their superiority to listen? And how do we get those who would otherwise be tempted simply to submit to their abuse to have the courage to oppose them? And that's where I think the founders had somewhat greater wisdom than the people who reduced their views to a caricature. They were faced with a real problem, and they wanted a solution that had some chance of being translated into a relatively lasting reality. And they understood one principle, a little bit cynical perhaps, but nonetheless verified by much of human history, that power ultimately only respects a greater power. Isn't that sad? Power cannot be relied upon to respect greater wisdom. No, power doesn't necessarily respect greater wisdom. It doesn't necessarily respect greater holiness. It doesn't necessarily respect all these things. Sometimes it does, you know. Sometimes the Pope will come out of Rome and talk Attila out of sacking the place or whatever, but a lot of times it won't work. And people die and they're raped and whole civilizations are destroyed, so that the smoking ruins left behind are today called deserts. That's what the Mongols did in great parts of the world. So power doesn't necessarily respect this, except to say, how can you come up with something that might be a little more reliable than that? I think the aim of the founders was at least to invoke a paradigm that offered a surer foundation for our appeals to conscience. For what better logic to face power with than the notion that whatever power you have, I gain my dignity from the absolute greatest power of all. The one that you can't touch, the one that you cannot equal, the one before which every human power pales by comparison. And because I can claim my dignity by virtue of that greater power, even on the day you defeat me, even on the day that you put your foot upon my neck and trample me into the dust, I still live in the hope that my justice will rise, because you cannot defeat his will. That is not what I have just articulated, not the statement of some abstract hope that would give comfort to philosophers as they read their books. Now, what I have just stated is the kind of thing that when you stand before a nation threatened by oppression will move the hearts of people in that nation to lay down their very lives for the sake of its liberty.